Lenora Keene had set 17 broken bones, stitched up 42 knife wounds, and pulled 3 bullets from men who had no business being alive, but not one single soul in the town of Caldwell, Kansas had ever thought to ask how she was doing. It was the autumn of 1879, and Caldwell sat right on the edge of the Kishom Trail like a coin balanced on its rim, spinning and trembling with the energy of cattle drives and gamblers and men who came through with ambitions too large for their boots. The town smelled of horse sweat and sawdust, and the particular metallic tang of the tannery on the south end of Main Street. It was a town that chewed people up if they were soft, and it had tried very hard to chew up Lenora Keene. It had failed. She was 28 years old, with dark auburn hair that she kept pinned severely at the back of her neck because loose hair had no business in a surgery, and she had sharp gray eyes that could read a man's pain before he had the nerve to say a word about it. She stood 5 feet and 4 inches tall, and she had the kind of hands that were simultaneously her greatest pride and her most persistent source of exhaustion, because those hands never seemed to stop working. Her clinic occupied the bottom floor of a 2-story building on the main street, sandwiched between the general store run by old Hector Paulson and the somewhat less reputable establishment operated by a woman named Della Bright, who sold whiskey and information in equal measure. Lenora's name was painted above the door in white letters on a dark green background. Lenora Keene, physician and apothecary. The sign had been painted by a drifter she'd saved from a nasty infection, and he'd done a fine job of it. The paint was starting to chip at the edges now, and she kept meaning to ask someone to fix it, but she never quite found the time. She had not found time for very many things these past 3 years. She'd come to Caldwell from St. Louis, where she had studied under a physician named Dr. Warren Halsey, who had been progressive enough to teach a woman the full scope of medicine, and old-fashioned enough to pay her half what he paid his male students. She'd taken what he taught her and left, because half pay and half respect were not enough for a full life. She'd heard about Caldwell from a cattleman who came through St. Louis with a festering wound, and a story about a town that had no doctor and therefore no hope, and she had thought, quietly, that a place with no doctor might be a place that needed her exactly as she was. She'd been right about the need. She'd been slightly wrong about the welcome. The men of Caldwell had looked at her sign and looked at her hands and looked at her face and made their own calculations. Some of them came anyway, because a wound that might kill you had a way of making you reconsider your prejudices. Others sent their wives, who came gladly and warmly and told their friends. Within a year, Lenora had enough patience to keep herself busy from before dawn until well after dark. Within 2 years, she had a reputation that stretched up and down the trail. Within 3 years, she was as much a part of Caldwell as the water tower and the church, and people had stopped being surprised by her and simply started relying on her very heavily. She had delivered 11 babies in 1879 alone. She had managed outbreaks of cholera and dysentery that came in with the trail crews in the summer. She had set bones and lanced infections and made medicines from her own herb garden, which grew in careful rows behind the clinic in a patch of ground. She'd cleared herself with a pickaxe and her own 2 tired arms. She had counseled grieving widows and frightened mothers, and she had held the hands of dying men, and she had done all of it without complaint, because complaint did not seem to be something that was offered to her as an option. People brought her bread sometimes. They brought her preserves. Old Mrs. Hargrove left a pie on her step every Sunday without fail, peach in the summer and apple in the fall, and Lenora ate those pies with more gratitude than she ever showed, sitting alone at her kitchen table after the last patient had gone. The community appreciated her in the particular way that people appreciate a reliable thing. They appreciated her the way they appreciated the well that always had water in it, or the road that didn't wash out in the rain. They were grateful she was there. They never once considered what it cost her to be there. On the first Tuesday of October, 1879, 3 things happened. The cattle drive arrived from Texas. A man named Ralph Shelby rode into Caldwell, and Lenora Keene ran out of laudanum. The laudanum situation was the most immediately pressing problem of the morning, because she had 3 patients with varying degrees of pain-related complaints, and 2 of them were going to be very unhappy when she told them she'd have to send to Wichita for a new supply. She was standing behind her counter doing the arithmetic of her medicine stores, adding and subtracting and coming up short, when the bell above her door jangled with the particular aggression of someone who was not accustomed to walking gently anywhere. She did not look up. "I will be with you in a moment." "Take your time," said a voice, low and unhurried and carrying a warmth in it that she did not immediately recognize as anything other than ordinary politeness. She finished her calculation, made a note in her ledger, and looked up. The man standing in the doorway of her clinic was tall enough that the top of his hat nearly brushed the frame, which meant he was at least 6 feet. He was somewhere in his early 30s, she estimated, with the kind of weathered outdoor look that came from years of working under a sun that didn't much care whether you wanted shade or not. He had dark brown hair that curled slightly at his temples where it was damp, and a square jaw covered in 2 or 3 days of dark stubble, and brown eyes that were currently taking in the interior of her clinic with an expression of quiet and genuine interest, rather than the vaguely suspicious assessment she usually got from trail men who weren't sure what to make of her establishment. His left arm was wrapped in a cloth, doing it himself and doing it badly. "You wrapped that yourself," she said. "That obvious. The knot is wrong and the pressure is insufficient. Sit down." She gestured to the examination table without ceremony and came around the counter, reaching for clean bandages and her basin. "What happened?" "Barbed wire." He settled onto the table with the careful ease of a man who was accustomed to discomfort. "Coming through the south pasture on the McCready spread. Manager there let me cut through, and the wire was down in the grass where I couldn't see it." She unwrapped the cloth and looked at the wound. It was deep but clean, a jagged tear across his forearm from elbow to mid-arm, the kind that looked dramatic but wasn't particularly dangerous if it was properly cleaned and closed. The cloth he'd wrapped it in was not entirely clean, which concerned her more than the wound itself. "How long ago?" "About 2 hours. Cleaned it as best I could with the water from my canteen." "That is better than nothing." She was already working, her hands moving through the routine with the efficiency of long practice. She cleaned the wound thoroughly, which made him hiss once through his teeth and then go quiet and still, which she appreciated. Men who couldn't stay still during treatment were one of her persistent frustrations. "You are new to Caldwell. Arrived about an hour ago. I heard you were the person to see." "Who told you that?" "Man named Garrett Holt. He said, and I am quoting here, that the lady with the green sign would fix me up and not make me feel like an idiot for getting into trouble." Lenora paused for just a fraction of a second, surprised in spite of herself. Garrett Holt was a rancher on the western edge of town who had been one of her more reluctant patients, a stubborn man who had initially refused to let a woman treat his broken wrist. He had since come around considerably, but she hadn't expected him to be in the habit of recommending her to strangers with quite such generosity. "Garrett Holt said that," she said. "He seemed to mean it." "He is a converted man," she said, allowing the smallest smile. "Hold still." She began to close the wound with neat sutures, and the man on her table held absolutely still, watching her work with an expression she could feel without looking at him directly. An open and unself-conscious attentiveness that was somehow less intrusive than the staring she sometimes got and more present than the deliberate avoidance she got from men who were uncomfortable with the whole situation. "You are good at that," he said. "I am aware." He laughed, a genuine sound with no edge in it, and she found herself unexpectedly pleased by it. "I am Ralph Shelby. I am sorry I didn't say so first." "Lenora Keene." She tied off the last suture and reached for her tin of salve. "Are you with the drive that came in this morning?" "I was as far as Caldwell. I am stopping here. I've been contracted to help run the cattle operation on the old Fairweather land north of town." The new owner, a man named Peterson out of Abilene, is setting up a breeding ranch and he needs someone who knows cattle. And that is you. That has been me for about 12 years. He looked down at her work on his arm and his expression shifted into something that was clearly appreciation. That is fine work. Keep it clean and dry for the first 3 days. Come back in a week and I will check the sutures. She began wrapping the arm properly with the right pressure and the right knot, and she was aware that he was watching her hands with that same attentive quality. Change this bandage every day. I will give you the supplies to do it. How much do I owe you? $2. He reached into his vest pocket without hesitation and placed $2 silver on the counter. And then he did something that genuinely stopped her hands for a moment. "Miss Keene," he said, and his voice had shifted into something careful and sincere, "you look like you have not slept in 2 days." She looked up at him. He was not saying it with pity or with judgment or with the peculiar condescension that sometimes came from men who noticed her fatigue and interpreted it as evidence that she was overwhelmed and in need of rescue from her own profession. He was saying it the way a person says something they have noticed and have decided, after a moment of consideration, that it is worth saying aloud because they mean it with kindness. "Are you all right?" he asked. The question was so simple. Are you all right? 4 words that almost no one asked her. 4 words that she was in the habit of asking 50 times a week. 4 words that landed now with a strange and startling weight that she was not prepared for and that she did not know what to do with. "I am fine," she said, which was her reflexive answer and which was, in the technical sense of the word, true enough. He did not look entirely convinced, but he did not push. He stood, setting his hat back on his head with a practiced tilt, and he picked up the small parcel of bandage supplies she'd wrapped for him. "Thank you," he said. "I'll be back in a week." "See that you are," she said. He walked out of her clinic, and she stood at her counter for a moment longer than was strictly necessary, looking at the $2 silver and feeling something she couldn't quite name moving around inside her chest like weather changing. The rest of the day swept over her in its usual relentless fashion. A boy of 9 named Tommy Hargrove, old Mrs. Hargrove's grandson, came in with a foot he'd cut on a piece of glass. A trail hand came in with a fever she didn't love the look of but determined was not cholera, just a particularly mean summer cold that had lingered too long into autumn. 2 women came to discuss their pregnancies, one of them Clarice Benton, who was 7 months along with her 4th child, and handling it with the brisk pragmatism of a woman who has done this before. Hector Paulson from next door stuck his head in to ask if she needed anything from his next order, which she did, and she gave him a list of supplies including the sulfur she needed for her skin remedies. She ate her supper standing up at the kitchen counter because sitting down for supper meant having the energy to sit down, and she was running a deficit on that particular resource. She had a slice of bread with some butter and the last of a jar of blackberry jam, and she washed it down with tea that had gone slightly cold, because she'd forgotten about it during a consultation. She was washing her teacup when she became aware of an ache in her right hand that she had been ignoring for approximately 3 weeks, a deep and persistent ache in the joints of her fingers that she knew, professionally, was the beginning of something she was going to have to take seriously eventually. She was not yet ready to take it seriously. She flexed her fingers against the ache and dried the cup and put it away. She went to bed at 10 o'clock and lay in the dark thinking about a pair of brown eyes and a voice that had asked, with no motive she could discern beyond simple human consideration, whether she was all right. She did not immediately know what to do with that. Ralph Shelby came back in 5 days rather than 7, and he came back not because his arm was giving him trouble, but because he was standing outside the general store when he witnessed Lenora Keene emerge from her clinic carrying a crate of supplies that was clearly too heavy for one person to manage alone, and he covered the distance between them in about 4 long strides and said, "Let me take half of that." She did not have the breath to argue, which was itself information about the weight of the crate. He took the bottom half of the load and they carried it around to the back of the clinic together, setting it down by the herb garden, and she straightened up and pushed a strand of hair off her face and looked at him with an expression that was somewhere between gratitude and mild suspicion. "Thank you," she said. "Where did that need to go?" "Inside. I would have managed." "I know you would have." He picked up the crate again as if the matter were settled. "Where inside?" She held open the back door and watched him carry the crate into her storage room and set it on the table she indicated. And she noticed that he did it without any of the performance that sometimes accompanied men doing women favors, without the pointed look that expected effusive gratitude, without the commentary about how he hoped she would be more careful next time. He just did it and stood back and looked around the storage room with that attentive quality she remembered from before. "This is an impressive operation," he said. "It is what it needs to be." He turned to look at her. He had not come from work this time, or at least he'd changed from work clothes because he was wearing a cleaner shirt, dark blue with small buttons, and his hat was the same battered brown one, but he'd clearly brushed the dust off it. She did not know why she noticed these things. She was not in the habit of noticing what men were wearing. "How is the arm?" she asked, returning to professional ground which was solid and familiar. "Good. No redness, no discharge. I've been following your instructions exactly." "I should check it. That is why I came by." He followed her into the examination room and rolled up his sleeve with the ease of someone who had gotten accustomed to her particular matter-of-fact approach to bodies and their problems, and she checked the sutures, which were healing beautifully. She had always done good suture work. "Another week and I can take these out," she said. "All right." She stepped back and began tidying her tray of instruments, and he did not move to leave, but he also did not crowd her or impose. He was simply present in a way that she found, somewhat to her consternation, not unpleasant. "Can I ask you something?" he said. "You may ask." "That herb garden out back, did you plan it yourself?" She blinked. Of all the questions she might have expected, this was not among them. "I did. Why?" "The layout is interesting. The taller plants on the north side so they don't shade the shorter ones. The way you've grouped them by water need. It looks like someone who knows what they are doing." He paused. "I grew up on a farm in Missouri. We had a kitchen garden. My mother was particular about it." Something in his voice when he mentioned his mother was quiet and fond and slightly old. The way people sound when they are talking about someone they loved who is no longer living. Lenora recognized that sound. She had heard it many times in patients who were telling her their histories. She had occasionally produced it herself. "My mother taught me what she knew," Lenora said. "I learned the rest from books and from trial and a great deal of error. Does the lavender grow well here? Better than it has any right to in this climate. I think the soil on this side of the building is better drained." She looked at him. "You are not what I expected a cattleman to be interested in discussing." He smiled at that, and the smile did something to his face that made it considerably warmer and younger and more appealing than it already was. "What did you expect a cattleman to be interested in discussing?" "Cattle," she said. He laughed, and she laughed too, briefly, and it surprised her the way a sudden patch of sunlight surprises you when you have not been watching for it. He came by again the following Saturday, not as a patient this time, but carrying a basket of apples that he set on her counter with a slightly self-conscious directness that she found endearing despite herself. "From the trees on the north end of the Fairweather property," he said. "There are more up there than I know what to do with, and the men have eaten their fill. I thought you might have use for them." She looked at the basket. It was a good basket, full of good apples, and she could think of 3 things she could make with them that would be useful and 2 things she could make with them that would be personally enjoyable, and both categories were welcome. "Thank you," she said, and then, because the door was quiet for once and the afternoon light was coming through the window in a way that made the clinic feel less like a workroom and more like a place where people could occasionally exist without crisis, she said, "I was about to make tea." "If you are not in a hurry." He was not in a hurry. They sat at the small table in her back room, the room that was nominally her kitchen and sitting room, and occasionally her dining room, and sometimes, on the worst nights, her crying room, though she did not mention that last function to him. She made tea on her small stove, and he sat in the chair across from her, and they talked the way people talk when they are discovering each other, with a careful attention to what the other person says, and a growing willingness to say things they don't usually say. He told her about the farm in Missouri, about growing up the second of 4 children, about a father who was hard but fair, and a mother who was soft but tough in the quiet way that mothers sometimes are. He told her about how he'd started working cattle at 16 when the family farm was struggling, and how he'd gotten good at it, and found that he had a particular understanding of animals that was part skill and part something harder to name. He'd worked his way up the trail circuit for years, and now he was trying something more settled, more permanent, which was why the position on the Fairweather land had appealed to him. 31 years old, he said with a slight wry quality, and I've been living out of saddlebags for over a decade. It seemed like time to have a place. What kind of place are you hoping for? She asked. He looked at her with those brown eyes that were thoughtful and direct without being invasive. A real one, he said simply. Not just a bunkhouse, something that's mine. She understood that. She had her clinic, which was hers, but it was both everything and not quite enough, and she understood the particular longing that he was describing without being sentimental about it. She told him some things too. Not everything, not right away, because she was not in the habit of offering her interior life to people she had known for 10 days, but some things. She told him about St. Louis and Dr. Halsey, and the grinding experience of being taught to be capable by a man who simultaneously did not believe she was capable. She told him about why she'd left and how she'd come to Caldwell, and how the first 6 months had been genuinely hard in ways that she'd managed but not enjoyed. People came around. He asked, most of them. Some of them still come to me only because there's no alternative and they make that clear enough, but most people have come around. That must have cost you something, he said, those first months. She looked down at her tea. It did, she said. I imagine it still does, he said quietly, and she looked up at him and found that he was not looking at her with pity but with a kind of honest recognition, and she realized that he was one of those rare people who could hold difficult truths steadily without trying to fix them or dismiss them. It still does, she agreed, and the honesty of it, said to another person rather than only to the walls of her kitchen, was strange and relieving in equal measure. The following 2 weeks were busy even by Caldwell's standards. The cattle drives continuing through town meant a steady supply of minor emergencies, and a particularly bad week of weather in mid-October brought a rash of respiratory illness that kept Lenora running through her medicines and her patients in roughly equal proportion. She was up for most of 2 consecutive nights, treating a family of 6 who had all gone down with the same lung illness, and she was running on very little by the time Thursday morning arrived. She was at her counter at 7 in the morning, trying to write out her medicine orders for the week, when she became aware that her hand was shaking. Not dramatically, not enough for anyone to see from across the room, but she could feel it in the pen, a fine, persistent tremor that was the signature of a body that had been pushed past its comfortable limits. She set the pen down. She looked at her hand. She made the practical calculation that she had done this before and she would do it again, and that the shaking would stop if she ate something and rested when she could, and she picked the pen back up. Ralph appeared at her door at 8:30 with 2 bread rolls and a jar of something she couldn't immediately identify, and he looked at her across the counter with an expression she was beginning to recognize as his particular form of concern, direct without dramatizing. You didn't sleep again, he said. I slept some. Lenora. She looked up at the way he said her name. It was the first time he had used it without the formal address, and he didn't seem to have noticed he'd done it, or if he had decided not to walk it back. It sounded natural in his voice, more natural than she would have expected. What is in the jar? She asked. Bean soup. Rosa at the boarding house made it this morning, and there was more than the house needed. He set it on the counter along with the bread rolls. "Eat something. I have patients coming. It takes 10 minutes to eat bread and soup, even here." She looked at the food and she looked at him, and she was suddenly aware of being extremely tired in a way that she usually kept carefully partitioned away from the part of herself that showed to the world. She was aware of the ache in her hand. She was aware of the longing for sleep that lived behind her eyes like a constant low-level headache. "Thank you," she said, and her voice came out slightly less steady than she intended. He did not make a big thing of it. He simply said, "Is there anything I can do to help this morning? I don't have to be at the ranch until noon. I don't know medicine, but I can carry things and sit with people and do whatever useful work you need." She stared at him. It was not an offer she received from anyone. People came to her for help. They did not come offering to provide it. "I could use someone to ride to the Paulson store and pick up my supply order," she said, testing it. "Done. Write me a list." She wrote him a list. He took it without reading it immediately, tucking it into his shirt pocket, and then he pushed the bread rolls closer to her side of the counter. "Eat first," he said. She ate first. He came back with the supplies in 40 minutes and helped her stock the shelves with a quiet competence that suggested he had organized storage before, which she supposed someone managing a ranch operation would have. He did not require direction for every small thing. He used his own judgment about where things should go, and when he wasn't sure, he asked rather than assuming. It was a remarkably efficient morning for being an improvised one. When he left for the ranch at noon, the clinic was better stocked than it had been that morning, and she had eaten 2 bread rolls and a full jar of soup. And she felt, for the first time in several days, like a person who had a reasonable chance of making it through the afternoon. She found herself watching the door after it closed behind him. The October weather settled into something more moderate, and the pace of the clinic eased marginally, which meant Lenora was only exhausted in the ordinary way rather than the extraordinary way, and this gave her slightly more mental space to think about things she did not usually give herself space to think about. Ralph Shelby was among those things. He came by most days now. Not always as a patient, not always with a particular purpose, but consistently. He learned the rhythms of her clinic well enough to come by in the quieter windows, mid-morning or early evening, when she was between patients rather than in the middle of one. He brought food sometimes, and other times he brought nothing but himself, and they talked through her back window while she tidied her herb garden for the winter, or through the open front door while she reorganized her shelves. She learned things about him the way you learn a landscape, gradually and with increasing detail. He was methodical and patient, which she supposed made him good with cattle. He had read more than she might have initially guessed, having spent years carrying books in his saddlebag as a substitute for the company he was too private to easily seek. He had strong opinions about which type of knot was superior in various applications, a conversation that started as a joke when he helped her retie some of her garden stakes, and turned into a genuinely interesting 30 minutes because she had opinions too, and they were not entirely the same. He was funny without trying to be funny, which she found rarer and more appealing than deliberate wit. He was honest without being blunt, which was a more difficult balance to strike than most people understood. He was, she was beginning to understand, someone who thought carefully about what was true and then said it, because he believed that was what respect looked like. She found this particular quality devastating in the best possible way. One evening in late October, she was closing up the clinic when she heard raised voices from the alley beside the building and went out to investigate, because raised voices near her clinic were professional information as much as anything else. She found a man she recognized as one of the trail hands, a large and red-faced person named Duncombe who had been in for a minor ailment 2 weeks ago, arguing with a younger man she didn't recognize. And the argument had the particular hot quality of something that was moving toward being physical. She stepped between them with the authority of a woman who had spent 3 years being the most competent person in a room full of people who didn't initially want her there. "Gentlemen," she said, and the word carried a tone that was not precisely a warning but was in the vicinity. Duncombe looked at her, and the immediate physical tension in him deflated somewhat, the way she had noticed it often did when men who were about to do something foolish were interrupted by the presence of someone with obvious authority. "Dr. Keene," he said, with a slightly sheepish quality. "Is anyone injured?" "Not yet," said the younger man, who had the look of someone who was still deciding whether to be embarrassed about the scene. "Let's keep it that way," she said. "Go find somewhere else to have this conversation, somewhere I don't have to hear it." They went. She stood in the alley for a moment and breathed the cool evening air, and was aware of a bone-deep tiredness that the moment of authority had pushed aside, and that was now coming back in the aftermath. "You do that well," said Ralph's voice behind her, and she turned to find him standing at the alley entrance, having come from the direction of the main street. He had evidently seen the tail end of the situation. "I do a lot of things well," she said, but without the sharpness she might have put in it on a better day, because she was tired and the evening was cold, and he was looking at her with that particular steady quality that she had stopped trying to be brisk against. "You do," he agreed, and he stepped closer and looked at her properly. "You're cold. It's October. Come inside and let me build up your stove." "Ralph." "Lenora." He said her name the same careful way he always said it now, like something with value in it. "You just faced down two men who were about to start something, and you're standing in an alley in a light dress in October air. Let me build up your stove." She let him build up her stove. He built it up, and then he sat in her back room while she sat across from him, and they drank the last of the tea she had, and outside the window the October wind moved through the street of Caldwell with a sound that was lonely in a comfortable way when you were inside and warm. "Can I tell you something?" she said. "Please." "I don't usually let people take care of me," she said. "I notice that you have been doing it and I have been letting you, which is not my usual pattern, and I don't entirely know what to make of that." He was quiet for a moment, in the way he was quiet when he was thinking rather than finding words. "I don't think there's anything you need to make of it," he said finally. "People are supposed to take care of each other. It doesn't have to mean anything more than that." She looked at him over the rim of her cup, and if it does mean more than that. The room was very still. Outside, the wind moved. The stove ticked with warmth. Ralph set his cup down on the table with a small, deliberate sound and looked at her with those brown eyes that she had been reading daily for weeks now and could not quite stop reading. "Then it means more than that," he said simply. "And I am not going to pretend otherwise, because I told you I think honesty is what respect looks like, and I respect you a great deal." Lenora held that for a moment. She was a woman who had learned to keep her own counsel, to be economical with her interior life, to protect herself in a world that had not always extended her the protection she needed. But she was also a woman who had decided, a long time ago, that cowardice was not a quality she could afford or admire, and she tried to practice what she preached. "I think it means more than that," she said. "For me as well." He exhaled slowly, and she saw in that exhale the evidence of something he'd been holding, a tension she hadn't been sure was there because he had been so steady about not pressing her, and she thought about all the ways a person could hold something quietly and wait for the right moment, and she thought he was remarkably good at it. "All right," he said. "Then I'd like to take you to supper. Not here in the back room with leftover tea. An actual supper." She smiled. It was a full smile, not the careful contained one she used on patients, and not the brief unguarded one that occasionally slipped out when he said something unexpectedly funny. A full, deliberate smile that meant what it meant. "I would like that," she said. The supper was at Clara Whitmore's establishment, which was the closest thing Caldwell had to a proper restaurant, being the dining room of the Whitmore boarding house, open to the public on Friday and Saturday evenings, when Clara felt the inclination to cook for strangers. The food was good in the plain and hearty way that good frontier food was good, and the room smelled of roast and cornbread, and Ralph was already there when Lenora arrived, having arrived early to secure the table by the window, because he had thought she might like the view of the street in the evening. She had dressed with slightly more care than she usually gave the matter, in a dress of dark green that she'd made herself 2 years ago and worn 3 times, with her hair down from its usual severe arrangement into something softer and less clinical. She saw Ralph's expression when she came through the door, and she felt the warmth of it move through her chest like something long awaited. They talked through 3 courses and 2 hours without difficulty or effort, because they had already established the language of each other, and now they were simply exploring it further. He asked her about her training, and she told him the full story this time, the parts she didn't usually tell, the specific frustrations and indignities of being a woman in medicine in 1870s America, and the specific triumphant moments that had kept her going when she wasn't sure she would. He listened to all of it with the attentive gravity she had come to expect from him, and when she finished he said, "That makes what you've built here even more impressive." "Don't let me be impressive," she said. "Let me just be myself." He smiled. "You being yourself is what I find impressive." She looked down at her plate to give herself a moment. "You are not what I expected," she said. "When you walked into my clinic that first day, what did you expect? Someone more difficult?" He laughed at that, the genuine full laugh. "I'll take that as a compliment. It was intended as one." After supper he walked her back to the clinic, which was only 2 blocks but felt longer in the pleasant way that the end of a good evening sometimes stretches itself. They walked slowly, close enough together that their arms nearly touched, and the night air was cold and smelled of wood smoke from the various stoves along the street, and somewhere north of town, a coyote was testing its voice against the dark sky. At the door of the clinic he turned to face her and she turned to face him, and they were close in the manner that 2 people are close when they have arrived at a moment and are deciding together what the moment is. "Thank you for tonight," she said. "Thank you for coming." He was looking at her with an openness that was neither urgent nor restrained but simply honest. "May I come back tomorrow, not as a patient, just to come?" "Yes," she said. "Come back tomorrow." He did come back the next day, and the day after, and the day after that, and the pattern of him in her life began to solidify into something she relied on in the way she had previously only allowed herself to rely on medicine and her own capabilities. It was a new experience, relying on a person rather than a skill, and it was occasionally frightening and more frequently wonderful. November arrived, and with it the particular stillness that came over the plains in the first cold weeks, the cattle drives thinning out as the season pushed toward winter and the town settling into its quieter self. Lenora had a steadier clinic now, fewer emergency arrivals and more regular appointments, and she had time to think in a way she had not had since the summer. She thought, often, about the direction her life was taking. She thought about the fact that Ralph Shelby had said, quietly and without pressure, that he wanted to build something real and permanent. And she thought about the fact that she wanted that too, had wanted it for a long time, had simply been too exhausted by the wanting with no prospect of it happening to let herself feel it fully. He had kissed her for the first time one evening when she was pulling the last of the autumn herbs from the garden before the hard frost came, cutting the lavender and bundling it with practiced hands, and he had been helping her, and he had stopped and looked at her in the particular way that meant something was about to change, and he had said, "Lenora, may I?" with such steady courtesy that she had said yes before she had finished processing the question. The kiss was careful and warm and honest, the way everything about him was, and when it ended, she held the bundle of lavender against her chest and looked at him, and thought that this was the man she wanted to be looking at for a very long time. November deepened and things between them deepened with it. They spent evenings together when her schedule allowed and Sunday afternoons when it was possible, sometimes talking and sometimes sitting in comfortable quiet while she wrote in her medical journal, and he read whatever book he had gotten from the small selection at Paulson's General Store. He told her about his plans for the Fairweather Ranch, about the breeding program he was developing with Peterson, about the particular challenges of building something from scratch in land that had been neglected. She found herself taking a genuine interest in the cattle business that she had not previously held. She found herself telling him things about her herb garden and her medicine formulations that she did not usually tell people, because people were not usually interested, and he was, genuinely and sustainedly, interested. He asked good questions. He remembered what she had told him before. He built on prior conversations rather than arriving at each one fresh. She was falling in love with him, and she knew it with the same clinical precision with which she knew anything. But this particular diagnosis filled her with a warmth that her clinical precision did not usually produce. He took her riding on a Sunday in mid-November, north along the edge of the Fairweather property, which had become the Shelby operation in practice, if not yet fully in name. He had arranged a horse for her from the stable, a steady gray mare he'd assessed personally for temperament before bringing her, which she noticed and appreciated without saying so directly. They rode out into the pale November land, the grass bleached to gold and the sky enormous, and the sound of the wind through the grass making the prairie seem like something breathing. She was a moderate rider, not having had much occasion to improve her skills in 3 years of clinic-focused living, and he rode beside her at an easy pace that required no adjustment to accommodate her and made her feel no pressure to perform competence she didn't have. That, she had come to understand, was characteristic of him. He calibrated without making the calibration visible. He showed her the land, what it had been and what he was planning, the fences that needed replacing and the barn that needed reinforcing and the house, small but solid, that sat on the northern rise with a view across the plain that made her stop her horse and simply look for a long moment. "That is the view from the porch," he said. "Every day," she said. "If you live there, every day." She looked at the view and then looked at him, and there was something in his expression that was holding a question it hadn't yet asked, and she did not push it. She turned the horse and they rode back toward town in the late afternoon gold light with the wind at their backs, and she felt a happiness that was different from satisfaction and different from contentment, a larger and less settled thing, the happiness of wanting and having the wanting answered. December came with its cold and its particular quality of darkness, and Lenora found herself navigating the winter clinic season, which brought with it the respiratory ailments and the frostbite cases, and the particular misery of people who had been cooped up too close together, and were spreading illness efficiently among themselves. She managed it as she always managed it, competently and without complaint, but with Ralph now a consistent presence, she found the managing somewhat less grinding than it had been in prior winters. He showed up one morning in the first week of December to find her clinic full, 3 patients waiting and a 4th already in the examination room, and he simply took off his coat and hat, rolled up his sleeves, and spent 4 hours doing the logistical work that kept a full clinic running, heating water and fetching supplies, and sitting with a frightened child who needed a tooth pulled while her mother looked away. Holding the child's hand with a calm steadiness that made the whole experience considerably less terrible than it might have been. Lenora, watching him from across the room after the tooth was out and the child had been given a piece of hard candy from the jar she kept for exactly this purpose, felt something crystallize in her chest with a quiet and definitive clarity. In the evening, when the clinic was empty and cleaned, she came and stood beside him where he was washing his hands at her basin, and she said, "You know you did not have to spend the whole day here." "I know," he said, drying his hands. "But you did." "I did." He turned to look at her. He was close enough that she could see the tired lines at the corners of his eyes from a long day of work that was not his work, and the warmth in those brown eyes that was consistent and quiet, and did not diminish with proximity or time. "I love you," she said, because she had decided that cowardice was not something she could afford or admire, and this was a moment that deserved the truth said plainly. The expression on his face was something she was going to remember for the rest of her life. It was not surprise exactly, though there was a quality of that in it. It was more like recognition, like hearing the answer to something he had been working toward without knowing the answer was coming. And then his face settled into something soft and full and certain, and he said, "I love you too. I have been loving you, I think, since you told me that you were aware you were good at suturing and didn't apologize for it." She laughed, a little wildly, and he pulled her into his arms and held her against his chest with a gentleness that was not about fragility, because he understood she was not fragile, but about care. And she held on to him in the way she had not allowed herself to hold on to anyone in a very long time. "I want to ask you something," he said, his voice against her hair. "Ask. Not tonight, when I've done it properly." She pulled back enough to look at his face. "Properly," she said. "I have an idea of what properly looks like, and it involves more planning than I have currently done." His expression was serious, but there was something playing at the edge of it. "Give me a week." "A week," she said. "Give me a week," he said again. She gave him a week, during which he was present and warm and entirely normal, and did not give any outward indication of what he was planning, which she respected as a performance of discipline. She did not try to anticipate or prepare. She simply lived the week the way she lived all her weeks, working and thinking and feeling the new and still slightly astonishing reality of being loved by someone she loved in return. He came to the clinic on a Thursday afternoon a week and 1 day later, which was 8 days, technically, but she was not counting. The clinic was quiet in the mid-afternoon pause, and the winter light was coming through the windows in long, pale slants, and he came in with his hat in his hand and looked at her across the counter with an expression that was both composed and deeply serious. "Lenora Keene," he said. "Ralph Shelby," she said. "I have been thinking for 3 years that the life I was building needed one more thing, and I could not precisely identify what that thing was. I have been thinking for 2 months that I know exactly what it is, and it is you. Not because I need to be taken care of or because I want to take care of you, though both of those things are true in various measures, but because when I am with you I am more fully myself than I am any other time, and when I am not with you I am thinking about when I will be again." He paused. "I want to build a life with you. I want to be with you in the day-to-day particular way that doesn't have anything romantic to say for itself, but is the actual substance of a life. I want to sit across from you at breakfast and hear about your difficult patients, and tell you about the cattle and argue about knots." He reached into his vest pocket and placed a small ring on the counter between them, a simple gold band with a small garnet stone that was the color of dark red wine. "Will you marry me?" Lenora looked at the ring and then looked at him, and the answer was in her before he had finished the question, had probably been in her for weeks, but she let herself have the full feeling of it first, the full weight and warmth of being asked, of being seen and wanted specifically and deliberately. "Yes," she said, "I will marry you." He came around the counter in 2 steps, and she came to meet him, and he kissed her with a thoroughness that was not careful but was still entirely honest. And she thought, with the small clinical part of her mind that never entirely stopped observing, that this was the most significant diagnosis she had made in 3 years of practice. They were married in February of 1880, in the Caldwell church on a clear cold morning when the sky was the particular winter blue that has nothing in it. And Reverend Dawes performed the ceremony with the pragmatic warmth that he applied to all things. Clarice Benton, who had delivered her 4th baby successfully in November, and had thereafter adopted Lenora as a personal cause of celebration, helped her dress in the small room behind the church. And old Mrs. Hargrove cried throughout the ceremony in a manner that was both audible and cheerful. Ralph stood at the front of the church in his best clothes, which were considerably better than his working clothes, but which still carried the particular quality of a man who lived outdoors and was only temporarily indoors. And when she came down the short aisle, he looked at her with an expression that was not composed at all. And she found that she loved him even more for that, the unguarded quality of it, the absence of any attempt to look as if he were feeling less than he was feeling. She said her vows clearly and meant every word. He said his vows clearly and meant every word. Reverend Dawes said things about the nature of commitment and partnership that were actually quite good for a February morning in a frontier church. And Caldwell turned out in numbers that were genuinely touching, because for all that they had taken Lenora for granted in the way of reliable things, they did love her after their fashion, and they were glad she was glad. The wedding supper was held at the Whitmore boarding house with Clara's considerable assistance, and there was dancing afterward in the cleared dining room, fiddle music provided by a man named Declan, who played with more enthusiasm than precision, but who made up for it in commitment. Ralph was not an accomplished dancer, which she had suspected, but he was willing, and he held her with the kind of care that made the technical lapses entirely beside the point. "Are you all right?" he asked her in the middle of the dancing, and she looked at him and thought about the first time he had asked her that question 8 months ago, standing in her clinic with his badly wrapped arm and his unassuming brown eyes, and how it had been the question no one asked her, and how it had moved something loose in her that had been stuck. "I am more than all right," she said. "Good," he said. "Me too." They made their life in 2 places, which was slightly unusual and entirely practical, because the ranch needed running, and the clinic needed running, and neither of those things could be done from the other one's location. Ralph rode into town most mornings and back to the ranch in the evenings, a habit that made him a familiar sight on the road north of Caldwell, and Lenora kept the clinic running with its usual relentlessness, but with the knowledge now that at the end of the day there was a door that would open, and a person who was glad to see her. She began spending Sundays and one other day per week at the ranch, riding out with him or riding out after him, and she brought her medical knowledge to the ranch operation in ways that turned out to be more useful than either of them had anticipated. She managed the health of the horses with the same systematic approach she brought to human medicine, and she identified a problem with the grazing rotation that was causing nutrient deficiency in the cattle, in a way that a physician could see, because it looked precisely like a nutritional deficiency in any mammal. Ralph implemented her suggestion, and the results were good, and he told his employer Peterson about it, and Peterson came out from Abilene specifically to meet the woman who had solved his cattle problem with medicine. Peterson was a practical man from Abilene who liked useful people regardless of their gender, and who was building a business in an era and landscape that required clear thinking above social convention, and he and Lenora got along well on the strength of that mutual pragmatism. Spring of 1880 arrived with the particular vigor of a prairie spring, everything coming back at once, and Lenora's herb garden burst back into life with a determination she always found encouraging. She had expanded the garden over the winter, planning additions while the ground was frozen, and Ralph had spent a March weekend helping her dig the new beds, which was exactly the kind of ordinary particular thing he had promised her, and which she valued exactly as he had predicted she would. She told him in April that she was expecting their first child. He was in the middle of mending a section of fence when she told him, having ridden out to the ranch in the mid-afternoon with the specific purpose of telling him, and he stopped with the fence tool in his hand and looked at her, and the expression on his face was so completely open and overwhelmed and glad that she felt tears come to her eyes that she did not try to prevent. He set down the fence tool and came to her and held her face in his hands and looked at her as if she were something remarkable, which she was, though not only for the reason he was currently thinking of. "A baby," he said. "A baby," she said. "Are you well? Are you all right?" He was immediately practical alongside being emotional, which she had expected and which she loved. "What do you need? Are you tired? Are you—" "Ralph," she said. "Yes. I am a physician. I am very well qualified to manage this." He laughed, slightly overwhelmed. "You are," he said. "You absolutely are. But I will tell you what I need," she said, "and I trust that you will help." "I will help," he said. "I will do anything." "Good." She leaned her forehead against his. "Right now what I need is for you to finish the fence and come home for supper, because I am making your mother's bean soup from the recipe you taught me, and I would like you to tell me if I am getting it right." He held her for another moment and then, with evident effort, picked up the fence tool. "Go start the soup," he said, his voice not entirely steady. "I will be finished in an hour." She rode back to the ranch house smiling. The pregnancy was not easy in all its particulars, because pregnancy was a medical condition even when it was a joyful one, and her body had its own opinions about the whole enterprise. But she managed it with the combination of professional knowledge and personal determination that she brought to everything. And Ralph managed it with the combination of practical helpfulness and careful attention that was simply who he was. He worried. She saw him worry and she let him worry, because it was honest of him, and she did not want to ask him to pretend he wasn't feeling what he was feeling, and because his worry was a form of love that she could receive without embarrassment now that she had learned how to receive things from him. She also worried, in her clinical way, about the health complications she knew were possible, and she corresponded with a physician in Wichita about certain specifics, and she made her preparations with thoroughness. The clinic continued to run. She trained a young woman named Patience Aldridge, who had come to Caldwell with her husband, and had expressed an interest in medicine that Lenora recognized as both genuine and considerable, to assist in the clinic during the months when she would need assistance. Patience was quick and careful and had good hands, and Lenora found the training satisfying in a way she had not anticipated, passing on what had been passed to her. In November of 1880, on a cold night when the wind was testing the seams of the ranch house, and Ralph had kept the stove well fed all evening, their son was born. He arrived with considerable noise and opinion, which Lenora, even in the extraordinary experience of giving birth, found encouraging as biological indicators went. He was healthy and substantial, and had, she noted when she first looked at him properly, his father's brown eyes, though she supposed all babies started with dark eyes, and it was too early to know for certain. Ralph held his son for the first time with the kind of deliberate carefulness that a very strong person uses when they are holding something they cannot risk breaking, and the look on his face was a thing she would keep with her always, private and quiet and enormous. "Hello," Ralph said to the baby, in the low, unhurried voice he used for things that mattered. "I am glad you're here." The baby made a sound that was not quite agreement but was not quite disagreement either, which seemed about right for someone who had just arrived and was still taking stock. "What shall we call him?" Lenora asked. She was tired in the profound way that was the other side of enormous work, the good tired, the tired of completion. "I thought," Ralph said without looking up from the baby, "that we might call him James, after my father, if you agree." "I agree," she said. "James Shelby, that's a name that will hold him." "It held my father," Ralph said. "He was a good man." "I'd like the name to continue." Lenora watched her husband with their son, and felt a love that was larger than any diagnosis she had ever made, larger than anything she had professionally catalogued, a love that was a whole landscape rather than a single point. James grew the way babies grow, with startling speed and particular personality, and the ranch house grew with him in the way that houses do when they are lived in by people who are building something. Lenora continued to run the clinic, with Patience Aldridge as her regular assistant now, which meant she could maintain the work she loved while also being present for her child in the way she wanted to be. The arrangement was not always perfectly balanced, because life on a frontier town with a busy medical practice was not amenable to perfect balance, but it was sustained and it was good. Ralph was, predictably, an excellent father. He was patient and he was present, and he was the same person with his son that he was with everyone he loved, honest and attentive and willing to ask what was needed rather than assuming he knew. He taught James the things he knew about animals and land with the same methodical care he brought to everything. And James, from the age at which he could toddle after his father across the yard, was a devoted student. Caldwell continued to be Caldwell, which meant it continued to be loud and dusty, and full of the particular energy of a town on a trail, and it continued to need Lenora in its comprehensive way. The years of the early 1880s were eventful ones on the frontier, with the cattle industry at its height and the dynamics of the region in constant motion, and she navigated all of it with the competence she had always had, now buttressed by the life she had built rather than operating in the absence of one. There were hard things. There were always hard things. A fever outbreak in the spring of 1881 that took 3 people before she got it under control, a loss that she carried quietly and professionally, and only fully acknowledged to Ralph in the evenings when they were alone, and she could put down the professional weight. He listened to all of it those evenings, with the same attentive gravity that had been present from the first, and she was grateful for the listening in a way that went beyond words. He had a difficult season, too, in the fall of 1881, when a pricing collapse in the cattle market threatened the viability of what he'd been building on the Fairweather land, and she sat with him through those evenings in reverse, listening while he worked through what needed to be done and what could be salvaged and what had to simply be accepted. He found his way through it by the spring of 1882 with a restructured operation that was smaller but more sustainable, and she learned from watching him manage it that the patience he brought to everything was not a passive quality but an active one, a willingness to do the slow work rather than the dramatic work. By the time James was 2 years old and saying words with more confidence than accuracy, Lenora knew she was expecting their second child. She told Ralph the same way she had told him the first time, directly and simply, and he received it the same way, with that open, overwhelmed gladness that she had stopped being surprised by but had never stopped being moved by. This pregnancy was different from the first, not dramatically but in the particular ways that second pregnancies are different from first ones, and she managed the differences with the clinical attention she always paid to her own body's information. She was 31 now, and she was well and she was happy, and happiness turned out to be a genuine health variable in a way that the textbooks of the era were only beginning to acknowledge. Their daughter arrived in the spring of 1883, on a morning when the ranch yard was full of mud, and the first green was coming back into the prairie grass, and everything smelled of rain and possibility. She came into the world with her mother's directness, and her father's patience visible already in the quality of her early crying, which was purposeful rather than despairing. They named her Clara Ann, Clara for the woman who had hosted their first supper and their wedding supper and who had become a genuine friend, and Ann for Lenora's mother, who had died when Lenora was 19 and whose memory she carried with respect and love. Ralph held Clara Ann with less of the first-time deliberate carefulness and more of a warm confidence that came from having done this before, and James, brought in to meet his sister, looked at her with the focused assessment of a 2-year-old making a decision, and then touched her hand with one careful finger, and apparently decided she was acceptable. Life on the ranch and in the clinic and in the town continued to grow and deepen. Patience Aldridge had become a capable medical practitioner in her own right, and Lenora found herself in the unexpected role of mentor, which suited her because she had always believed that what she knew should not stop with her. She expanded the clinic in 1882, adding a second examination room and a small surgical room that made certain procedures possible without the compromises she'd been making with space since she opened. The town of Caldwell changed around them, because towns on the Kisham Trail were in a state of constant change in those years as the cattle business evolved and the frontier pushed further west. Some people left and new people came, and the population shifted and grew. Lenora remained, as she had always been, the person people came to when they were broken, and she continued to fix them with the skill and competence that had always defined her. But she was no longer only the clinic. She was Lenora Shelby now, though she kept her professional name as Keene, because the name had been on the sign when the work was built, and the work deserved to carry its original name. She was a wife and a mother and a friend and a citizen of Caldwell in a way that was fuller than it had been in the years when she was those things only in potential. She was loved specifically and deliberately and daily by a man who thought asking about her welfare was not optional but essential, and she had learned from his consistent example to receive that attention without deflecting it. She had also learned, more importantly, to extend it to herself. Not perfectly, not always, because 3 years of not doing so was a habit with deep roots, but with increasing frequency and honesty. She rested when she needed to rest. She told Ralph when she was struggling rather than waiting until she was past struggling and had to pretend she was fine. She took Sunday afternoons for the garden and the quiet and the view from the ranch porch when she could, and she held those times as seriously as she held her medicine stores and her appointment schedule. Ralph noticed all of this and said nothing about it directly, which was perhaps the most loving thing he could have done. The gift of not making her self-care into a project or a performance, but simply allowing it to exist as what it was, a person learning to value herself by being valued. One evening in the spring of 1884, they were sitting on the porch of the ranch house after supper, James asleep inside, and Clara, and not yet quite asleep, making occasional sounds that suggested she was doing battle with the concept but was not winning. The evening was warm for April, and the prairie stretched out before them in the long dusk light, and the sky had turned that particular western color that exists for about 20 minutes between sunset and dark and looks like the inside of a seashell. 5 years, Ralph said. She looked at him. He was looking out at the prairie with the content and attentive quality he had for landscapes he loved. "Since I walked into your clinic," he said. "Not quite 5 years. It will be 5 in October." She did a brief calculation. He was right. October 1879 to this April of 1884 was 4 years and some months. "Almost 5 years," she agreed. "I was thinking about what you must have seen when I came in," he said. "Trail dusty man with a badly wrapped arm." "I saw a man who had wrapped his own arm because he was the only one available to do it," she said. "That told me something about you before you said a word." He looked at her. "What did it tell you?" "That you were accustomed to being your own resource," she said. "That you were competent and independent and not given to dramatics." She paused, "And then you asked if I was all right. You looked like you hadn't slept in days." "I hadn't. Someone should have asked." "You did," she said. He reached over and took her hand, turning it palm up in his and looking at it the way she had noticed he sometimes did, with an attention that was not clinical but was thorough, the way he looked at things he was taking seriously. Her hands had changed in 5 years, more lines in them now, the joints of her fingers carrying the slight thickening that she knew was going to be a persistent companion. She had told him about the ache in those joints, and he had listened, and he had not told her to stop working or suggested that she was less because of it, only asked what helped and paid attention to the answer. "Are you all right?" he asked, the same 4 words, the words that had started everything. She looked at the prairie and the sky and the ranch that was theirs and thought of James asleep inside, and Clara Ann losing her battle with wakefulness, and the clinic in town, where she had built something that mattered, and the man beside her, who asked every day in various ways whether she was well and actually wanted to know the answer. "Yes," she said, and she meant it with her whole self, with the professional part and the personal part and the tired part and the glad part, all of it simultaneously true. "I am all right." He brought her hand to his mouth and kissed her knuckles, the ones that ached, with a gentleness that understood what it was acknowledging, and she leaned against his shoulder and they stayed on the porch while the sky finished its 20 minutes of extraordinary color and settled into the comfortable dark. Inside, Clara Ann surrendered to sleep. The prairie breathed around them in the mild spring dark, and somewhere on the northern edge of the property, a coyote called once to the rising moon, and Caldwell lit its lamps along the main street in the distance, and everything was as it was and as it should be, and as they had made it together. 3 years later, in the autumn of 1887, Lenora and Ralph sat in the growing comfort of a life fully built. James was 7 years old and had his father's patient observation and his mother's directness and a particular talent for numbers that was going to take him somewhere, though it was too soon to know where. Clara Ann was 4, with opinions about everything and a clarity of expression that her father admired and her mother recognized from the inside. The clinic had been expanded again, and Patience Aldridge was now effectively a co-practitioner, taking on patients of her own with Lenora's consultation, which meant the work was being shared at last in a way that gave Lenora actual breathing room on the harder days. The ranch had found its sustainable rhythm. The breeding program Ralph had developed had produced results that Peterson in Abilene was genuinely pleased with, and there had been conversations about Ralph taking on a formal management partnership, which would mean a different kind of stability and a different kind of future. He had told Lenora about it carefully and asked what she thought, and she had thought it through carefully and told him, and they had made the decision together as they made all their significant decisions. Through the same honest conversation that had begun on the day he walked into her clinic with his badly wrapped arm. One October morning, Ralph came into the clinic, not as a patient and not as someone bringing food or assistance, but simply to see her, in the middle of the morning when her schedule had opened unexpectedly because 2 patients had postponed. He stood at the counter and she came out of the back room and looked at him across the space and said, "You're early." "Mrs. Patterson's fence held," he said, which was an explanation she could decode because Mrs. Patterson was a neighboring rancher who had been having trouble with her eastern boundary, and Ralph had been helping her sort it for weeks, which had been taking his mornings. "Finished yesterday afternoon, earlier than I planned." "Good," she said. He came around the counter and kissed her unhurried, the way he kissed her when they had all the time in the world, which they did not, but which he sometimes pretended they did as a form of generosity. "We've been here 8 years, she said against his shoulder. "You've been here 8 years, he said. "I've been here 4.5. Almost 5. Almost 5. He held her with his easy strength, and she could feel the warmth of him and hear the steady sound of his heartbeat, which she had listened to medically once when he'd had a chest cold and found to be extremely regular, which was a very good sign for a man of 37. "Are you happy?" she asked, not because she doubted it, but because she believed in asking the things you actually wanted to know. "Lenora," he said, and his voice had in it everything she needed to hear. "I'm the happiest I have ever been." He pulled back to look at her face with those brown eyes that she had been reading for almost 5 years and would go on reading for all the years after this. "Are you?" She thought about the question the way he had taught her to, seriously and honestly, without deflecting. "Yes," she said. "More than I expected to be, much more than I knew to want." He smiled, the full warm smile that still did exactly what it had always done to the general temperature of whatever room they were in. "Good," he said. "That is the right answer." She laughed and he laughed, and the October light came through the windows of the clinic, the same windows where she had first really looked at him 5 years ago, and it was a different kind of light now, warmer and more familiar, the light of a life that had been lived in rather than merely inhabited. That afternoon, she closed the clinic early for the first time in recent memory, because Patience could cover the remainder, and she rode north with her husband on the road she knew by heart to the ranch where her children were waiting. And the sky over Caldwell was the enormous western sky that never diminished no matter how many times she saw it. And the prairie grass moved in the way it always moved, with the easy confidence of something that has been there a long time and expects to be there a long time still. She had come to Caldwell to be needed. She had not expected to also be loved. She had fixed broken arms and broken bones and broken spirits for 8 years in this town, and she had been the reliable thing, the well that always had water, the road that didn't wash out, the green sign on the main street that meant help was available regardless of what the hour was. She had given all of that freely, and she had not regretted a day of it. But she knew now, in the full-blooded certain knowledge of someone who had lived on both sides of the question, that the giving was not the whole of life, that receiving was also required, that being seen and asked about and brought soup and helped with crates and kissed on the knuckles over joints that ached was not weakness or indulgence but a necessary human thing, and that a man who understood that and acted on it daily was a remarkable thing to find on the Kisham Trail in the autumn of 1879. She had fixed 17 broken bones, stitched up 42 knife wounds, and pulled 3 bullets from men who had no business being alive. And she had been fixed, in her own way, by 4 words and the man who meant them, and the life they had built from that beginning was hers as fully and completely and joyfully as anything she had ever made with her own good hands. The ranch came into view on the rise, the light in the windows warm against the October dusk, and she could see James in the yard already, watching the road for them, and somewhere inside Clara Ann would be eating or arguing or doing both simultaneously, and the life that waited there was specific and ordinary, and everything she had not known to want until someone had thought to ask if she was all right. She rode toward it with her husband beside her and her heart as full as the prairie sky, and she did not look back.